So I'm Andrew White. I just want to, first off, say thank you to the Sirus Fund and the Milano Foundation for making this and many of our other events possible. In addition to teaching politics at the Milano School, I direct the Center for New York City Affairs. Some of you know our work on the public schools and on child welfare and child and family services in New York and on immigrant communities. We do an unusual hybrid of investigative journalism and applied policy research and a number of other elements of our work that is mostly geared towards advancing innovation in policy in New York City. You can read a great deal more about our work and about our public programs at centernyc.org. The Center's approach to social justice and applied policy reflects the Milano School itself and its students. We teach the tools of urban policy and the skills of management, but we don't teach it in the antiseptic classroom. We use New York and other cities as laboratories, and we teach the difficult realities of policy implementation in a political environment. Usually our public programs focus on a particular policy area, like housing or child welfare or government finance. But since 2002, we've also hosted a number of discussions about the ways in which the news media deal with Mayor Bloomberg and how the mayor and his team have handled his public image. 8 years in, public perceptions of this mayor are all over the map, and I wouldn't say that there is one clear conventional narrative about him in the way that there was about mayors Giuliani and Dinkins late in their terms. And I think that's in part because Bloomberg represents a bundle of contradictions, really. On the one hand, he personifies this strong progressive ideology of an activist government. And on the other hand, many people criticize him as having helped transform much of this city into a very exclusive playground for wealthy people. So this morning's event essentially seeks to update the latest of these discussions. We held one just 6 months ago, which was very much focused on the media and its relationship with the mayor. We thought that with the mayoral campaign in full swing right now and with Joyce Purnicks' new biography of the mayor now in stores as of last week, this would be a good time to look at Bloomberg the politician. So how has Mayor Bloomberg reshaped mayoral politics in New York? Has the power structure surrounding mayoral elections and the political parties changed for good? Or is this just a temporary blip? Has Bloomberg had a significant impact nationally as a politician on other mayors and other cities? And what about this idea of independence? The day after Bloomberg won office, the Times published an op-ed that said he was his own man, that he didn't owe anything to anyone except the voters en masse. Not to unions, not to political parties, not to local legislators or other powerful lobbies, except perhaps to the 48% of Latino voters who put him over the top in that 2001 election. Today, his independence is of a different kind, and it's still very much related to his wealth as it was then. But it seems to me that if he doesn't need a even if he doesn't need a traditional electoral coalition of interest groups to win in November, he still needs a governing coalition that will make it possible for him to achieve some of his policy goals. And he hasn't always had that, as we know. At the same time, the Democratic Party machinery in New York is in turmoil, not exactly a fresh insight, but it seems like this only gets worse as power becomes more connected to big money and less connected to local favors. So what's next? Following today's moderated conversation, we'll have some time for audience participation. We'll try to finish up around 9:50 or so that there's time for Joyce to sign a few of her books out there in the lobby. Today's discussion will be moderated by Glenn Thrush, who is my former colleague at City Limits, and he spent several years at City Hall covering the Bloomberg administration for Newsday before heading to Washington, D.C., where he covered the Hillary Clinton presidential campaign, and for the last year plus, he's been reporting on Congress as a news blogger at Politico.com. He's in the eye of the storm in Washington right now, and he even has his own widget. Anybody else in this room have their own widget? Funny thing is, at City Limits, City Limits, at City Limits, Glenn covered the hard-boiled politics of places like East New York and the South Bronx and the Rent Stabilization Association. So I'm hoping he'll bring a bit of that to this discussion, a bit of that sensibility tempered by the craziness that he's witnessing in Washington. Our other panelist, Adam Lisberg, is a City Hall bureau chief for the New York Daily News. He started at that paper as a general assignment reporter in 2004. And he has covered everything from social services to now the campaigns. Doug Muzzio is a professor at Baruch College's School of Public Affairs and co-director of the Center for Innovation and Leadership in Government, and a commentator and analyst for WABC-TV. And Joyce Purnicks is author of Mike Bloomberg, Money, Power, and Politics, which she wrote over the last couple of years after working at the New York Times for 35 years. Or working, she's written about New York City government and politics for over 35 years, most of it at the New York Times. At least in my adult lifetime, her name and the New York Times are inextricably linked. So, you all want to come on up?
Good morning, everybody. See some familiar faces out in the audience today. Joyce Purnicks' book begins with her first meeting with Michael Bloomberg. I'd like to read a little bit from it. I'm sure she won't mind. The first time I met Mike Bloomberg was in the late 1990s at a dinner party in his Manhattan townhouse. Bloomberg himself barely made an impression. He sat at the head of the table and said little, looking bored. Later, as rumors grew that he wanted to run for mayor, I was astonished, and I was not the only one. That guy, the dull, quiet one? My first experience with Michael Bloomberg, my first direct meeting with Michael Bloomberg, was on September 12th, 2001. I was, at the time, working as a reporter at Bloomberg News, an extraordinarily lucrative job, if not a necessarily rewarding one. And at the time we were writing, obviously we were engaged in writing a lot of stories about what had happened the day before. And I was sitting on the computer taking notes from a lot of my colleagues in the field, and I felt two hands on my shoulders. And I look up, and it is a short guy in a blue windbreaker with docksiders. And Bloomberg leaned into my ear and said, I'd like to thank you all for what you're doing under these circumstances. I did not meet him again in person for another year and a half. At that point in time, I had departed Bloomberg to become a City Hall reporter for Newsday. And my next encounter with Mike Bloomberg was at the 2003 Inner Circle dinner at the New York Hilton. And Bloomberg was accompanied by Matt Winkler, who was then I think he's still the editor-in-chief of Bloomberg News, a guy with a rather irascible temperament and a reputation for not being very kind to people who left his organization for other news-gathering outlets. So it was with some trepidation that I greeted the mayor and Winkler outside the ballroom. Winkler, to my surprise, extended a hand and a smile and said, "Nice to see you." I extended my hand to Bloomberg, who grabbed my hand, pulled me close towards him, and whispered in my ear, "Traitor," preceded by a four-letter epithet that was recently repeated on Saturday Night Live. So I think that range of experience more or less encapsulated the 2.5 years I spent covering Bloomberg at City Hall, a very eventful 2.5 years, the first 2 years of his term. The other thing that I sort of think of when I think of Bloomberg is, I don't know how many of you have seen the movie The Third Man. There's a very famous scene where the sort of protagonist and devil character, Harry Lime, played by Orson Welles, looks down on Vienna and he sees all the people walking around, and he is asked to sort of explain why it is that he is as evil as he is. And he says, I got the quote here, hold on. In Italy, for 30 years under the Borgias, they had warfare, terror, murder, and bloodshed, but they produced Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and the Renaissance. In Switzerland, they had brotherly love, 500 years of democracy and peace, and what did they produce? The cuckoo clock. Now, having covered Rudy Giuliani for some period of time, I can tell you he was not Swiss. So my first question to Joyce is Mike Bloomberg one of the city's greatest mayors, or just its most boring?
If this book had been written, had been written when I expected it to have been written, or put another way, if this book had been published when other factors were different from the way they became, I perhaps can answer your question. I expected, obviously, it's a circuitous way of saying I expected this book to come out after he left office, after his 2 terms, under the term limits law. That was the plan, and the plan was to make an attempt, as difficult as it is to write about history as it's happening in contemporary times, to make an attempt to sum up his unusual 2 terms compared with every other mayor I had ever seen. The third, what I call his attack of third-termism, changed the book, and I think made it impossible to put him in the kind of context that I hoped to. I will say that of the mayors I've covered and those I've studied, he's certainly among the most effective. Boring, he rates pretty high. I would probably have to put a beam above him. I'm sorry, I covered him, and
but shorter.
He really, I would really rank Bloomberg above Beam on the boring quotient. But there's something else to be said on that score, which is, as a personality, he's not, as we know, or at least as a public personality, he's not compelling. What he's done, both before he became mayor and as mayor, is fascinating. As we all know, the story is a fascinating, intriguing, opposite of dull story, which makes for another contradiction. I mean, it is a contradictory story about how a guy who just is anti-charismatic, as far as I can tell, was able to do so much in his life. I mean, if you stop right now, it would be more than just about anyone I could think of.
And that's the other characteristic that is an interesting contrast between him and Giuliani, isn't it? The fact that Giuliani had a great deal of drama during his 2 terms. And Bloomberg has really changed the essence of the mayoralty and the expectations of the mayoralty from being sort of entertainer-in-chief to sort of a manager. Is that really, do you think that is an accomplishment on his part? Do you think this is a permanent change, or is this just...
Well, I was going to quibble with your word change, because he's temporarily changed it, in my view. I think when he leaves office, which I suspect will be, strongly suspect he'll be reelected, and he'll leave office after another 4 years, I think we'll be back to politics as usual, just as it always has been after a reform, or even LaGuardia. I mean, LaGuardia is the paradigm of mayoral reformers, right? And most people don't remember that after his 3rd term, he was embittered, angry, he was physically ill. The term itself was not particularly distinguished. And then City Hall went back under the control of Tammany. So I think history will repeat itself. I think that, in my own view, Bloomberg is unique, and he has changed expectations for the period during which he governs. To some degree, I suspect it will all go back to the way it was when he returns, which had already been changing, by the way. It had changed under Koch, it had changed under Giuliani. So maybe there are little incremental changes, but I don't think we're going to see a multi-billionaire manager running the city of New York after him. I doubt it.
Mr. Lisberg, how has this push that he made to get the third term really in complicity with the city council, a city council that he spent a lot of his first term deriding as a joke, how has that sort of changed his legacy, and how has that changed the political dynamic of his reelection?
I think he and his campaign team are surprised to find that it is still affecting things. I think they expected that it would be a big flap when it happened a year ago, and people would get over it, and people would forgive it, and people would forget it. And I think I know I'm surprised how often I hear about it just from random people who aren't connected to politics. We had a couple questions in the Marist poll last week, and one of them was, are you tired of Mike Bloomberg? And 47% said yes, and 47% said no. So I think there is some Bloomberg fatigue setting in, and I think that's a big part of it, is that people think he just did something wrong. And that's overriding what I think is a real legacy as a good manager of the city. And as someone who's above politics, and Joyce gets into this in her book, that was sort of the first explicitly, nakedly political thing that he had done. That, you know, you always play games on the edges to get the Independence Party or to get some Republican in line. You know, you can't run a government unless you're willing to do some of that. But this was the first time that he went back on his word, twisted everybody's arm, did everything that he could, offered all sorts of things to all sorts of city council members just to get the 29 votes.
Doug, do you think the mayor was hypocritical?
Absolutely, absolutely. Two issues I want to talk about. Adam said, described the mayor as someone above politics, and Joyce talked about back to politics as usual. I think one of the insights of the book is that there was always politics as usual. Politics as usual is buying off the leadership of the Republican Party to get a nomination the first time and get the line the second time.
$250,000 to the state party prior to running for.
And politics as usual is the heavily negative campaigning, which Joyce articulates in the book. So I think there's a mythology out there that Mike Bloomberg is above politics and it is either his way or politics as usual. I find this narrative as the dominant narrative, and I think to a certain extent it's mythological. It's not based in reality. It is an acceptance of the mayor's and his people's, including his former communications director's, mythology that has been constructed around him. So there is this view that he is somehow plutocrat as philosopher king. Joyce describes him as a benign plutocrat. And the argument is, since he doesn't take campaign...
I think I say oligarch.
I think you say plutocrat.
I'd go with benevolent despot.
I'll find the page on the professor.
Well, I mean, is that a little harsh, Joyce? I mean, there is certainly an air of civility in the city, at least at the mayoral level, that wasn't there during Giuliani's tenure.
What word you said? Is a what?
An air of civility, at least on the mayoral level, in terms of his calling everyone Miss and Sir, anyway.
Well, I mean, Adam is right. There's no way to govern this city without playing politics. There's no way to win office without playing politics. Even I think with the millions that let Bloomberg spend. I think if you look at how he governed, particularly in the first term, in the second term, it started to look a little bit more familiar to me. But particularly in the first term, the level, I think, of independent judgment, just taking on the school system, is something I'm not sure we would have seen from someone else. It was a risk, and he took it, and he decided to attach his future to it. I think that it's easy to forget that, and I think that was not politics as usual. I mean, I'm not sitting here trying to defend him, but I am trying to put him in some kind of perspective. So I think that's one thing. I think choosing to raise taxes to balance the budget rather than to cut services was a very impolitic decision. Even the smoking ban, which we now look at, is sort of as just well, why not? But at the time, it was a big deal. And all kinds of traffic stuff that he did. He did a lot of things that he was governing with relative independence, and in some cases you can cross out the word relative. That started to change. I have no question about that, and you have no question about that. But if you, and the way he did a lot of things that upset me a great deal as a citizen of New York. I think the way he paid off the Independence Party more than once and ran with that crew is very, very upsetting, and he should be ashamed of it, in my view. And he claims that he isn't. I think he has to be. It's outrageous. The way he paid off the Republicans, it wasn't 250, it was more like 500,000.
You're right.
Dollars to the Republican Party. I mean, that's all standard politics as usual. So no one is saying that he's a saint, but if you look at some of his first-term initiatives, for good and bad, for example, I think the stadium was bad, there's a level of independence and I'm going to do just what I want, F you, and I'm sure he said it as opposed to my using the...
I'm shocked by that.
The letters.
Doug is going to...
You've heard it before. Yeah. So anyway, that I would say separate a little bit, at least, first-term governance from first-term politics.
Okay. I mean, clearly, what Mike Bloomberg did becoming mayor was showed that the city could be governed other than by a stern uncle, a screaming, I don't want to use the word fascist because of the Italian connection, but I since my last name is Muzzio. But clearly Mike Bloomberg came in and governed in an extremely important way in that first year. I mean, I've been highly critical of him, but I think his greatest accomplishment was in the aftermath of 9/11. The city was governed by a calming, effective adult. And that he got us through what could have been very difficult times, because after all, the voters in the city of New York bought a pig in a poke. They didn't know Mike Bloomberg.
Well, one of the really interesting parts of Joyce's book, I thought, and one of the areas where he really exerted a calming influence and was much talked about initially was his different attitude towards race relations in the city after Giuliani, which was a really inflamed situation. And you really, I think, get a very candid quote out of him talking about, I remember I was here during the Timothy Stansbury shooting when Ray Kelly and him went to the church. It was an entirely different shift. Mm-hmm. And the other really controversial thing that he did was not embracing, but reaching out to Sharpton. Mm-hmm. And the quote that, I just thought it was an extraordinary quote that he had about Sharpton, I got the one-day nasty editorial from the Post, and it was over. Rudy had the same albatross around his neck for years with Sharpton, and if he'd done that once, it would have gone away. The fact of the matter is when you have a racial problem, Sharpton's on your side, quieting things down. He'll yell and he'll scream a little bit. He has to do that for his audience, but personally, you know, ... Mr. Lisberg, do you think he has changed the tenor of racial relations in the city?
I think merely by being calm about things like that and about being willing to let things roll off his shoulders. The point I was going to make is that he really sees himself as a salesman. If you ask him, what kind of businessman are you? It's not inventor or engineer, it's salesman. And you've probably gotten more of this in your discussions with him than I ever have. But he doesn't have a problem with making his message malleable to the people who are listening. And he's very focused on his goals and what he wants to get out of people. You know, who has he not been able to get what he wants out of eventually? Albany, that's it. The city council, he still thinks of them as a joke and can get whatever he wants out of them.
Room 9, I would say.
Yeah, he believes we're, the Ben McGrath article said that he believes we're all sloppily dressed and resentful of power, and that's to some extent true.
You're looking, I think you belie that.
I dressed up today. But he doesn't really care what Room 9 thinks. He's more concerned with what the publishers and the editorial boards think, which is why he made sure to get them all lined up before he launched the third term bid.
Well, this issue with the press, Joyce, has been something which, if I'm not mistaken, I don't know, was it a joke that he made early on in his term about moving them out of City Hall?
I think it was.
But he's had a couple of
It was a wish.
It was a wish. And as a reporter who worked there, I could say it was at times my wish. But no, he's had some pretty significant run-ins lately that strike us with a long memory as being very, very late era Koch. Ozzy Paibara from Politicker New York asked him a legitimate, tough question in May about his rationale for running for a third term, and he called him a disgrace, which was captured, unfortunately for Bloomberg, on camera. And then there was an incident with a handicapped reporter in a wheelchair whose cell phone went off during a press conference. Is this a problem? Does this reflect a fundamental disrespect for the press?
Yeah. He really has there's a great deal of impatience with the working press, the political press. He prefers his advisors, if they're honest with you, and some of them more with me, the business press, or at least the business press that he dealt with in his day when he was running Bloomberg LP and was quite a figure when he was growing his business, and suddenly out of nowhere he became a billionaire. And there was one laudatory piece about him after another in the Forbes and Fortune and other business publications. And he said to me, you know, the business press, he said this directly, the business press, they care about content. And the political press basically cares about gotchas. That they just are looking for the big headline and they don't care about substance, which, as we all know, to some degree is true. But there also are serious journalists, and they play a very serious role in this city. And I think he has very little patience for that. Giuliani didn't have any patience for it either, and part of it, I think, and Koch at a certain point, although he certainly was more journalist friendly. I think part of this is Room 9 fatigue. My former colleague Jim Dwyer wrote a wonderful column after this incident. I think it was with the reporter who was in a wheelchair, and either that one or the other incident, or maybe both of them. And he said it happens to all mayors. He said they reach a point when they, oh God, I got to go listen to those. Got to go to this press conference. I got to listen to these questions. I got to answer all these questions, and I want to talk about the latest plan for modifying Part 2 of the housing initiative of 2003, and they want to talk about the headline that was on page 6, which is something to that effect. He wants to talk policy, and the press wants to do cheap shots. That's his view of us, I think, or most of us. And what Jim Dwyer was saying is that happens to all mayors at a certain point. They just start to pull their hair out if they have any and say, I've had it, I can't stand these people anymore. I mean, we have George Art here, and he could talk, former press secretary to Ed Koch, he can talk about that syndrome. I don't think there's any doubt that happens. So part of it is that, and part of it is sort of a basic impatience with having to deal with people that in the past, the business press reporters, he felt he could control.
Well, the one additional element that I think might be present is this is a man who is accustomed to having his way and had never participated in a democratic process before. Adam, do you feel as if he is somebody who really feels that there's really a need for you guys to be around?
It's funny, his attitude toward the press. You know, he's not really a press mogul. He made his money selling bits of financial information, not not putting the company on the line in a Pentagon Papers style case or anything like that. He's able to, in the abstract, support the rights of a free press and give lots of money to the museum, and say, reporters need to dig and they need to ask questions of politicians in Washington, and when they don't give an answer, keep coming back to it. But when you do that to him, I don't know if he deliberately ignores the comparison or he legitimately doesn't see one. But he believes that by putting out data points, by putting out the mayor's management report and things like that, that he's telling the public everything they ought to have, and he's sharing city information with the public because it belongs to everyone. But he does not see a lot of what we do as legitimate. He's put more information online about the nuts and bolts of city government than any prior mayor, but at the same time, it took me 15 or 16 months to get a FOIL request back for Kevin Sheeky's timesheets. So,
right, and Joyce makes that point that somebody, there are reporters at City Hall who are very well known for doing freedom of information requests of of information requests. It's a great way to tell what people are asking for and what it is that they're actually getting. And I think Joyce points out in her book that those were not answered in a particularly timely way.
Had a lot of trouble. They got it eventually. It took a long time.
Now, a lot of this gets down to money, which is a big part of your book. Doug, to what extent do you think that Joyce sort of talked about there not necessarily being a change wrought by the way that he's governed. Doug, do you think that the entrance of money and this expectation we now have of a rich guy, a Daddy Warbucks, sort of coming in and dominating the process, has changed the way that the political game is played in New York City?
I don't know if that's the case, but certainly Mike Bloomberg is unique in New York City politics and probably in American urban politics in the combination of the control of massive amounts of public money and dominating private money. I don't think we've never seen a Mike Bloomberg before in terms of that combination, and I don't think we're ever going to see a Mike Bloomberg again. I think Joyce is right in terms of that combination. He is sui generis. He's unique. And I don't know if he's produced a new paradigm or a new model. I think earlier on, or Andrew in his introduction alluded to the fact that what influence has Mike Bloomberg had on other mayors? Clearly, other mayors look to Mike Bloomberg as a manager and an administrator. Cory Booker in Newark, for example, is very admiring of Bloomberg and his methods. So I don't think there's necessarily a paradigm shift going back to what I said before. You have to play politics. Politics is good. I happen to believe what the Greeks believe, that politics can be ennobling. It's not a dirty word like Mike Bloomberg makes it. But there is a different view of what the mayor ought to do and be.
But doesn't he fit into a larger trend that Giuliani started of sort of bypassing, granted, most of them are corrupt, but bypassing these local political institutions that, for good or ill, created, created a lot of the good democratic leadership in the city?
He's going to different sources of power, and these are bought out. I hate to say just bought, because I don't think when he gives a donation to the Harlem Studio for the Arts or something like that, he's explicitly thinking 3 years from now I can have their executive director come and testify in favor of extending term limits. But the money helps, and whereas a traditional politician has spent years cultivating Democratic clubs in the Bronx, he's spent years cultivating, and Joyce does an excellent job of explaining this, business leaders, arts aficionados, nonprofit leaders.
Joyce has this sort of amazing quote from David Jones from the Community Service Society, which really blew me away. And I think CSS, which is a group that we all have relied upon in terms of particularly a lot of their housing studies, I believe got a $50,000 combo grant from Bloomberg and Carnegie. And she quotes Jones as saying, I think the personal funding has clearly kept the not-for-profit community very pro-Bloomberg. It chills dissent. You're going to watch what you say. And then he was talking a little bit about an op-ed piece that he wrote about housing. I remember this piece, actually, for the Daily News. And he said, I didn't hit as hard as I might, end quote, have hit Bloomberg had I not been receiving the money. Do you think that is, in and of itself, a form of coercion or corruption?
I did write a lot about that in the book. And the other thing he said was, with a smile on his face, but not entirely kidding, I got my bribe. Remember that?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, this is David Jones of the Community Service Society. Anyway, he said it sort of as ironically, but he did. He got his bribe. Well, we've never seen anything like this before. And for those who don't know, the mayor writes checks, in effect. He gives out millions and millions of dollars to civic and cultural groups through the Carnegie Corporation. This was an effort that began after 9/11, and it went originally to cultural groups, and it began as anonymous donations strictly to cultural groups that were having their city budget money cut because of the budget problems after 9/11. And it was anonymous, and that anonymity lasted a very brief time. And then everybody knew it was Bloomberg. And then he expanded it to include civic groups. In addition, in addition, and this is a part that a lot of people don't understand, and it took me longer than it should have to figure it all out. He also makes donations that, see, the Carnegie money is all publicly listed. You can go to their website and you can get every single contribution. And everybody know, well, it doesn't say it's Bloomberg. It's called the Bloomberg money in common parlance. That's what people talk about when they talk about getting their Bloomberg money. In addition to that, there's the Bloomberg Family Foundation, which is his foundation. And there's also his personal money. If he writes a check to the XYZ Civic Group, and he decides he wants to write it himself rather than put it through Carnegie or through the foundation, there's nothing to stop him, and there's nothing wrong with it. And if we, the press, finds out about it, it's because we got a glance at his income tax returns, which is where it has to be listed. But even there, it's sort of listed. Reporters can only see it a certain amount of time. It's about 2 hours, I think. They can't take copies of it. And a lot of the donations are, it's in a form of code. Well, A is so much, B is so much, C is so much. And one can understand if someone is worth a reputed $20 billion that he wants to protect the way he spends his money. But it does make it difficult to figure it all out.
And if I'm not mistaken, the Times actually brought a portable copy machine to the accountant's office when we were given 4 hours to, I wish Newsday did not have those resources at the time. Doug,
so just, I mean, I'm rambling a little bit here because, as you can see, it's an issue that is very difficult to figure out because I think he does good with this money. There's no question it does good. It also does him good. And that's the part that's very difficult to sort of calibrate, to get a sense of what it really means in a city where, I just want to make one more point, I promise I'll be good. In this city, just as in the federal government and as in the state, elected politicians, elected officials give away pork money all the time, right? Your local council member and your local assembly person and your senator and all the groups, all these civic groups and all the political groups know that the money that they're getting, which is public money that's being funneled by politicians, and it's called memberitis, or it's called this, or it's pork. So it's, how different is this? And is it worse, or is it better, or is it the same? These are the questions I tried to grapple with, and I never fully figured it out.
Yeah, I'd rather have him buy support with his money than mine.
But he also can dole out pork, as we know. So he's got these two channels. Sorry, go ahead.
Your point about that he does philanthropy and it does good and it does the mayor good sort of brings me back to my theme of politics as usual, going back to the great 19th, 20th century Woodhill, George Washington Plunkett, in one of his famous practical speeches on practical politics. He talks about going to the site of fires and getting people food and housing and clothing, etc. And the quote is something like, it's philanthropy, but it's mighty good politics too. So the connection of philanthropy and politics is an old one and an important one, and it is part of politics as usual.
Also called honest graft, right?
Well, no, honest graft is a little bit different.
But, you know, I just want to...
Mike Bloomberg doesn't need graft, whether of the honest or dishonest.
I have to just make one more point. When I spoke to, when I was writing this chapter, I literally sort of took a pin and said, I'm going to call this one or that one who got... I called a few people who were recipients. And one of them was the paper bag players. And, which is a little, they got, I don't know, 5,000, a very small amount of money, but I just picked up the cold call and I got the head of the artistic director, I think, and I explained what I was writing about, and he said, oh my God, thank God for Mike Bloomberg. If I didn't have that, if we didn't have that, we'd probably have to shut down this year in the recession, thank God. And I said to him, bless him, or something like that. And I said to him, but what about the political process? And who, I mean, you know, can you see yourself voting for anyone else? Which, of course, is the point, one point. And he said, oh, well, I hadn't thought about that. I'll have to think about it. He said, I'll have to just, I was really upset. My wife and I were really upset about this third-term stuff that he did. You know, it was like, what am I supposed to, and then he said, but isn't it better with a guy with all that money that he's spending it on us and not on, you know, something in Michigan or California or something? So it's a very complicated.
Well, obviously we're dealing with a third term because this presidential dalliance that he had did not quite work out in the way that
No.
Kevin Sheehy, his top political concierge, thought. He has a great quote, and to me it is sort of covering Congress now, is kind of a remarkable quote, where he talks about the idea for running for president, which he had played around with while Rudy Giuliani was floundering out in the field as an independent candidate and made that famous trip out to Oklahoma. This infamous trip out to Oklahoma. His quote was, running for president was, I'm paraphrasing here, but running for president was Kevin Sheehy's idea, not mine. How the hell does that work?
Well, it may work the same way when he says, ask the campaign, as if somehow he is divorced from the campaign, that there's Mike Bloomberg and then there's the operatives, and the twain doesn't meet.
Look, he wanted to run for president. He was intrigued, in my view, he was intrigued by the idea of running for president. He thought he could run for president. There's a quote from him in that book about, in effect, what did they know? I ran a company for however many years. I was all over, I dealt, because of this, my company, I was all over the world. People say I don't understand foreign policy. I've run a company. I've been all over the world. How can they say that? So on and so forth. I mean, he got angry that people would question his ability to be president. I think that it started out as a lark, where Kevin Sheehy dropped this little bomblet on, for those who don't know, he's the mayor's political advisor. And he dropped this little bomblet the day after Bloomberg won his second term. And Dominic Carter of New York once said, well, what next? Just passing, like thinking about policy. And Kevin said, well, how about the presidency? It was like, no, there was dead air. It was really extraordinary. Dominic was like, what? And then it built from there, and I think that he was totally intrigued. And I think he felt if lightning struck in the form of a right-wing candidate and a left-wing candidate being nominated by the two main parties, he could parachute into the middle. And
New Hampshire and Obama's, Obama's victory in Iowa, I think, really scotched that a bit.
Yeah.
But Adam, back home, I mean, he's got a, this third, and Joyce writes about it really convincingly, the third term is just typically a disastrous period of time for mayors, and we know that people like Ed Schuyler and a lot of the folks in his inner circle advised him not to do this, and were in fact sort of distraught when he decided to run for the third term. So this combination of having this failed dalliance with the presidency and sort of being the guest that wouldn't leave, here's a cheap question for you. What does that bode for the next 4 years, presuming he is reelected?
He knows the template is bad. He knows that third terms have not been successful, even for LaGuardia. And yet he couldn't help himself from running. I don't think that deterred him. I think he saw it as just another challenge. That when you're talking to a self-made billionaire who's taught himself how to fly a helicopter, this is a guy who likes challenges and likes the idea of doing stuff that nobody else has before. But he hasn't given a whole lot of concrete ideas of how a third term will be different, other than to say it's going to be more of the same. We're going to keep on reaching higher. We're going to, I think his environmental commitment in Plan YC is legitimate, even though it's only a couple of years old. So we could see more of that. But you look on the campaign trail. What are the big issues he's beating on? It's what he's done in education so far, which we could debate here endlessly. It's this crusade to fix the MTA, which is more about knowing that you get votes by beating up the MTA than he could actually do anything about it. We haven't seen a big intellectual framework for a third term yet. And I know I'll get angry calls from the
I think
campaign.
he'll rue the day. I think he will rue the day.
You think he serves it out?
Huh?
Do you think he serves out a full 4 years?
Yeah, if he can, if the health allows.
What would the
Well,
option
but I
be?
think there's no
Or if
reason to
something,
believe he
if
wouldn't.
presidency of the World Bank comes open, or if something else comes in?
I don't see the inevitability of a disastrous third term. It's as I remember the 1987 Giant Broncos Super Bowl at halftime. No team has ever come back after being behind in a half, and the Giants went on to win. There's nothing inevitable about failed third term.
That's a very Jersey thing to say.
Thank you. Or unsuccessful third terms. I think that that's the challenge, and I don't see that this is inexorable that the mayor's third term is a disaster or even a failure compared to his first two terms necessarily.
I think
Well,
go ahead.
The only thing, first, wouldn't use the word disaster. I think it could very well be uninspired. And then the reason is history. I mean, the reason to assume that, and maybe it's going to turn out not to be, but the reason to assume it is history. And you look at every mayor who served a third term, and each one of them has gotten tired or embittered. Corruption has seeped in around the edges. I mean, it has never been a good experience. Why? I think people get bored. The best and the brightest leave. It's hard to attract the best people. And I think he did it, in my own view, not because it was a challenge. I think he did it because he stared ahead at sitting in his combined renovated townhouse and writing checks, to philanthropic checks, which, as we all said, do good, but being retired from what has become a national stage. Being mayor is always a national. Always a national stage, and with his anti-illegal gun thing and his running for president, he's become very much a national figure. Koch was a national figure. Giuliani was a national figure. He said to me for the book, anywhere I go in the world, mayors, I get attention because I'm the mayor of New York. Suddenly he'd lose that platform. So I don't think, in my own view, it was a challenge. I think he did it because he wanted to remain in the public eye.
Yeah, I want to clarify. I don't think he ran again because he relished the challenge. I think he ran again because he had nothing better to do. The challenge is making a third term relevant. He knows that that's the issue. And while he's personally very energetic and still full of ideas, it's tough to keep a staff motivated that way. And what are you going to do in your 11th year in office if you couldn't do it in the first 10? Yeah. I think he's aware of that, and I think his staff is aware of that. But it's tough to bring people in to an administration like this. And I'm trying to picture him, even though he says he wants to shake up the staff, he's said since the day he announced that he was going to try to change term limits, he's been sending out these messages that we're going to shake things up. It's not going to be the same old, people shouldn't assume they have their jobs. But I'm having a tough time imagining the conversation when Ed Schuyler says to him, "I've had enough, boss. I gotta go. I gotta have a life." Yeah.
Well, that is, and I'd kind of, we're going to take questions in a couple of minutes, and I'd sort of like to frame. That's a perfect way to, a perfect coda, because the transformation that we're really talking about is from Mike Bloomberg, the billionaire business person, salesman, and philanthropist, into, gasp, a politician. Seeking a third term is something that a career politician who wants to remain in office does. And that is why, essentially, the term limits law was rammed through with Ron Lauder's assistance in the 90s to sort of keep career politicians from staying in, or at least that was what the purported purpose was. I'd like to ask each of you, can one say now that Michael Bloomberg is a politician, and is he a good one? We'll start with Doug.
Yes, he is a politician. Yes, he is a politician. I don't see that as a pejorative term, and I think he is a successful one on many levels. Certainly electorally, he's successful.
Joyce.
Oh, there's no question. I think that he's gone political. He got bitten by the bug and he's gone political. There's no question in my mind. Is he successful? I wonder how successful look, you've got two things going on. I'm sorry, I'm giving a long-winded answer, but incumbent mayors of New York never lose unless there's been a major failure or a major scandal. So the fact that he will in all likelihood be reelected, I don't think is a tribute to his political skills. It's a tribute to his incumbency and his money. And in addition to that, I think if you look back over his 8-year record, it's a pretty strong one. People disagree about his budget. They disagree about the union contracts. We all know what they disagree about his support for development. But the city has been run pretty well. I don't think anyone can argue that things have calmed down, and at least if the schools aren't have not improved as much as he says, At least he took it on. And nobody had done that for an awfully long time. So is he successful? I guess you'd have to say he's successful. And is he a politician? Yeah, he's gone political.
Yeah, he's definitely a politician. After, what, 8+ years of trying to win support and win votes, of course he is. Is he a good one? He's got great people working under him. He can afford to hire the best, both for his campaigns and in his office. They're tremendously loyal. They're very good at what they do. But again, I go to Albany as the example of him not being able to do the pure politics. You don't get anything out of Albany by being a benefactor and being a benign Medici-like figure in the city of New York. You get things out of Albany by playing games with people and threatening and giving and taking. And he couldn't do that.
Can I just raise one quick before you go to questions? I think it's important. I wonder how he's going to govern, assuming he's reelected, if in fact you pointed out Schuyler, and if he has a very small brain trust around him. Very few people who he really trusts. That's why I use the trust in that phrase. It's a very tight group, and if they start to peel off one after another, I don't know how he's going to be able to invest his trust in people that have not been with him. Most of them going back to Bloomberg LP.
I'd like to add one additional point before I ask for questions. Schuyler in 2000, I can tell you, Schuyler was fatigued in 2003 and 2004. Yeah. I remember sitting in the back of a car with him coming back from an event where he was just lamenting the fact that he never got to watch Sunday football anymore. Mm-hmm. I guess that's, long gone. And the other point I think, Joyce, that you make in your book was that the one, and this is one thing I wanted to touch on, is the one relationship that has frustrated him perhaps more than any other is his relationship with Shelley Silver, and his incapacity to sort of bend Silver to his will.
Which is where he hasn't been, as we pointed out, he has not been effective.
Although now
I don't know
Shelley's
who
his
could
best
be.
friend in Albany.
Right, well.
Well, nobody left.
Right. Yes, exactly.
And Shelley frustrates everybody.
Right.
Is Andrew anywhere? Questions?
Yes, my name is Marjorie Shea, and I'm with the Women's City Club of New York City. And I wondered, Bloomberg in his first term tried to get a nonpartisan election through his charter commission, and he failed drastically. But he would have us all voting today. You would not have only Democrats able to go to the poll today. Under the system he proposed, all voters would be able to go to the polls and participate in the primaries. Now, he failed drastically in that. Is he going to come up with that again if there is another charter commission?
I doubt it.
Yeah, I don't think so.
That initiative went down in flames, even though he, what was it, how much money? $7 million. He threw $7 million, his own money, in a campaign to get the people to support nonpartisan elections in his first term, as you pointed out.
And the consultant hired a Democratic consultant who led the counteroffensive against that is now working for Bloomberg's reelection campaign, Howard Wolfson.
He still talks about that failure. He still laments it and says, well, the city would be run better.
I don't think he'll do it again.
No, that was a failure of politics right there.
Joan.
I'm a recently retired New York City public high school teacher. And I think that in many ways, Bloomberg is an excellent manager. I think the 311 system was brilliant. And many of the things he's done, he got rid of a lot of lawsuits from Giuliani's ideological stuff. But I think it's very dangerous to say at least he took the educational system on. Because kids don't get do-overs. I don't know who here was at last week's Tom Ridge meeting. But if you remember the ringing cell phones, the cursing, that's what a high school classroom in my school became under Bloomberg. What was a large regional high school with a bunch of blue-collar kids, not great scholars, but many of them with excellent teachers doing better than they might have, became a system where the large regional high schools and New School's own report on the high schools said this, have more than 2/3 of the students, and it's become a dumping ground because the kids whose parents can't help them, I'm not going to say, the kids whose parents can't help them end up in the large regionals.
Well, that raises an interesting point. I mean, he's clearly staked a lot on education. To what extent do you think he's going to be regarded as a success or a failure in that regard?
Well, I mean, it's open right now. I mean, clearly, there seems to be underlying all the lies, damn lies, and statistics, there seems to be improvement in terms of learning in the classroom, whether it's because of the change in governance, whether it's because of the massive increase in the amount of dollars going in. There seems to be some improvement, but the data are so ambiguous, ambivalent, and often contradictory that we really don't know. So it's still an open issue. Now he's got 4 more years. And Adam raised the question, what does he do in his 11th year? Well, he repeals term limits again, and then he has the opportunity not to be a lame duck. But again, the schools, he said, judge me on the schools, as Joyce points out in the book. If we judge him on the schools so far, it's an incomplete.
Yeah, that's where I came down, incomplete, yeah.
Over there? Sorry.
I want to ask whether his stated policy objectives are taken too much at face value. I'm talking particularly about the environment, and here's my example. He said he was for reducing auto traffic in Manhattan and produced his congestion pricing plan. So it didn't work, and people said, well, he discounted the amount of resistance from the outer borough drivers. He didn't do the horse trading with Albany that he needed to do, but he is for reducing auto traffic in Manhattan. And I ask, how can that be when he goes around and rezones neighborhoods like Hudson Yards and the Far West Side, where empty rail yards and 2- and 3-story buildings are going to be replaced by dense clusters of 50- and 60-story buildings? How can that not mean more traffic, private autos, taxis, limousines, even if they have to pay the extra $8? How would it not mean far more auto traffic in Manhattan than he claims he wants?
Adam?
I have 2 theories on that. One is that he's not necessarily up to speed on the details of what the parking regulations require, that there are still big swaths of the city where you're forced to put in more parking than Jeanette Sadekhan might want. And the other theory is that if he is aware of that, he thinks of that as the kind of thing that has to get fought out between Amanda Burden and Robert Lieber and Jeanette Sadekhan. We saw this a couple weeks ago with the proposal to ban smoking in city parks. He likes letting his commissioners fight things out and agree on some policy proposals. He can certainly set the direction, but on details like that, and I don't think you're wrong, he's willing to let it work itself out. It's an unsatisfying answer, but I think that's what it is.
Hi. Ms. Purnick, you raised the issue of what the mayor's philanthropy does as silencing. This was the case when Philip Morris was the biggest philanthropist in the city, and cultural institutions could say nothing about their major source of income. He wears several hats, which then places a deadening effect, do you want your permit or whatnot. And there's an instance of several years ago that was buried between a public institution, the Queens Public Library, and the Museum of Modern Art, which is in the lead institution with connections. The museum has gotten several profound rezonings, the misuse of eminent domain, but because it had created this associate status with PS1, it got the ability to tap into the capital funds. And it went to the mayor's office and got a $60 million line that was to go to the Central Library of Queens and Jamaica for an expansion. And the mayor's office told them, the library, well, you're just a branch system, so you're not entitled to any of this when it was on the books. This was like what happened with the Brooklyn Public Library.
What is the question, please?
The point is that this story was buried. Anybody that I raised, what I stumbled across in the cultural and philanthropic community would finish my sentence. If you raise this, because MoMA is up again for a building that they propose on land that was gotten through eminent domain.
Thank you.
This is a kind of use, and I'm wondering what this really means. I don't think it's very ethical.
I'm just not familiar enough with this issue. I'd love to learn more about it. I can't really answer it based on your description. Maybe others can.
Next question, please.
Hi, I'm Mitty Owens with the NYU Wagner School and an independent community economic development consultant. I would love it if you would speak a little bit to Bloomberg's relationship to the financial services community and specifically the economic, what role the municipality could have played and did play in the economic meltdown. Obviously, this is largely a national issue and an issue of the market, and yet there are interesting questions about what municipalities could have, and in some cases, some around the country did do, in order to either help to limit a negative impact, especially in terms of the mortgage meltdown, and or to proactively and aggressively help to mitigate it. So foreclosure, prevention, counseling, things like that. And Bloomberg actually vetoed a vote that I think was close to unanimous in the city council to fight against predatory lending in his, I believe, in his first term, and vehemently opposed it. Okay. So I wonder if you could speak to that.
He's done some stuff.
Yeah, he's set up various initiatives on fighting predatory lending and trying to stop foreclosures, but those have been late. I think if I can generalize from this, he has this reputation, and his justification for running for a third term is that he's this incredible financial manager. And he's a good manager. He ran a multi-billion-dollar company, but as Joyce has pointed out, it's not that he has any special insight into the economy. He's used to hanging around the big mockers. Everybody who was involved in the bailout discussions a year ago is a friend and dinner companion of his. But he was giving out 4% raises to all the municipal unions as the tide was, clearly there was a big wave about to crash the city. And he's a good manager. I don't think he's a better economic.
The question for all of you is what does his attitude towards tax policy tell you about his view towards Wall Street? Doug?
No, I was just going to say that he speaks a lot about this, and we've all heard it, about how he felt that he had to protect services, and he didn't want to see another fiscal crisis or the effect of the fiscal crisis of the 1970s, when he felt a mistake was made in cutting back so severely that services were damaged. I think the city had to, and the state, it was really the state that did it. It was imposed on the city, and other mechanisms that were set up by the governor, who was Hugh Carey at the time. I don't think the parallel is a perfect one, but he feels very strongly to this day that you got to protect core services, and if that means raising taxes, you raise taxes. And he's very Wall Street friendly, but when it comes to taxes, he's going to raise them if he thinks the services are endangered. He makes no bones about that, right?
I mean, the bottom line is that Mike Bloomberg is a classic liberal Democrat, both in terms of his taxing orientations and his spending orientations. I think that's the bottom line. As Joyce correctly points out, he would protect services rather than cut them. So I think in terms of his ideological orientation is that of a liberal Democrat.
I think he's a liberal Democrat on spending, but on taxes, he would much rather raise property taxes than raise taxes on Wall Street profits. Okay. He doesn't support a millionaire's tax; he'd support a sales tax increase.
Well, not to belabor, but the other issue here, just to raise, is his company. And when he ran an information and journalism outfit covering Wall Street, I think it's an important. And as someone who is on the inside, I can tell you that Bloomberg News put a premium on breaking news about company developments, but was not at the forefront of investigations of fraud, lack of oversight. So Bloomberg News is not necessarily known as sort of a guardian of the public interest, as it is a disseminator of information for companies and investors.
For its clients.
Yeah.
My name is Ed Wesley. I'm from the Queens Civic Congress. Don't you think he'll be able to retain the very people that have are his brain trust because of money, money, money? Or are you suggesting that they'll leave because of money, money, money?
He takes good care of his people. They are well paid, not more than anyone else would be in city money, but then he transfers them to his campaigns and then gives them enormous bonuses as the end of the year as campaign for can't do it for a city employee, but you can for a political employee. So they are well taken care of financially, those close to him. I don't know what their personal decisions will be about the next phases of their life. We're talking about Patty Harris, we're talking about Ed Schuyler, we're talking about Kevin Sheekey, and a few others. I don't know. I would think after 8 years at City Hall, you might want to do something else with your life. But I don't know. It's a very personal decision and financial.
And it seems to me it's not only about money, or not necessarily even primarily about money, why people stay and why they go.
It's a lot of money.
No.
This is more than the norm.
No, I understand that.
This woman has had her hand up for quite some time.
I'd like to know why the media has never gone after Bloomberg for A, never putting his gargantuan assets into a blind trust, B, not divesting himself from Bloomberg News. Who ever heard of a political candidate, a political officer owning a news organization, even if he isn't directly involved? His name is still Bloomberg News. And C, why hasn't more of an analysis been made of Bloomberg's assets? Why did Forbes magazine do an article and say that Bloomberg was the only billionaire whose assets have gone up during this major downfall? And those three things, I think you have been lapdogs for Bloomberg.
Go ahead, Adam.
Yeah, Adam's a good one on that one. I was going to defer to Glenn. And if it's a good answer, I'll get you your dish.
I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Glenn, but I believe his assets are in a blind trust.
No, they're not. They're
I mean, there's several answers to it. One is, no, I don't think we've been lapdogs, thank you. One is that the Conflicts of Interest Board, which governs such arrangements and whether the mayor can pay private funds to public employees on the side or can... they are lapdogs, yes. That when he, I guess it was a year or two ago, he asked COIB for permission to put his assets into some more speculative ranges, sorts of investments. There are sacrifices you have to make,
and that's an issue. And that's an issue of city statute. I mean, that's an issue of statute. I mean, that is not an issue necessarily.
Right.
But the question about his day-to-day involvement in the company is something that has been widely written about. He replaced. He recently installed Dan Doctoroff, former deputy mayor, involved in the stadium debacle as his president of his company.
And I believe the Conflicts of Interest Board's idea was that it's unreasonable to ask someone to sell off their entire asset, to sell his entire stake in the company that you founded, as long as you stay out of the day-to-day operations and you have certain safeguards in place. Are they in place? That's a good question.
Yeah. Can I ask you a question?
So we want to do one more question, and then we're going to, well, then I'll wrap this up.
This is a question. Everyone has talked. It's been a very interesting session. I've loved the hour. You're all quite good. I didn't see any lapdogs. But the audience, it's a collection of...
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Talk
okay.
about
I was just saying that it was a good hour.
That's better, yeah.
And you're not lapdogs.
Thank you, Henry.
Never were. But the questions have all been questions of sort of small and large complaints about the mayor. Because that's what people say after 8 years. Didn't do this, didn't do that, yada, yada, yada. Probably a lot of it is true. But this is the point. Today is runoff day. I don't know. 5 weeks from today, there's a mayoral election. The candidates are Bloomberg and Thompson. I haven't heard a word about Thompson. You're judging Bloomberg on an entirely different scale than you would in judging Thompson, because there's so little to judge. I mean, that's the missing, that's not the, you know, the 800-pound gorilla, whatever it is. So could you venture a thought as to how the pros and cons of Bloomberg's experience and attitude compare with his candidate of the Democratic Party?
Henry, you can't beat somebody with nobody.
Right.
And even though Bill Thompson may not be a nobody, he's not known, and
Good save,
Bloomberg's
Doug.
known. He's got a record. He's got tens of millions of dollars. If you're a betting man, you're not betting on Bill Thompson.
Is there any achievement of Thompson's that you'd like to highlight?
I am not his campaign manager.
Sort of a roundabout way to answer your question. I think Bloomberg was on paper beatable this year. I've been saying all summer that he is beatable, and now with 5 weeks left, I think the clock is running out on Thompson to make that happen, but there's enough voter dissatisfaction with third term, enough Bloomberg fatigue, as we were talking about, that there was an opening there, but I think time is running out for Thompson.
I mean, the stronger candidate would, in my view, would have been Weiner, and I think that he would have given Bloomberg a run for his money. Literally. I don't think he would have won for the same reasons, the combination of incumbency, Bloomberg's record, and his money, all three. But I think it would have been a much stronger race. Thompson has been, there's been not much of a campaign. I thought it was going to sort of pick up after Labor Day. I haven't seen much from him. But this panel was deliberately set up not to be about the election. We wanted to talk about the incumbent mayor, so that's why we haven't talked more about it. That was
yeah, I would say, you know, one of the themes of next year, if and when he is reelected, if he is reelected, is going to be a question of how he relates to Albany in a changing situation in an election year in 2010, whether it's Giuliani or Lazio or Cuomo or Patterson.
Right.
It'll be fascinating to see if he can change that relationship.
Depends on whether Shelley runs again.
That too, Shelley, who runs Albany. We have stacks of Joyce Purnick's book out in the lobby, and she will go out there and sign some of them, and I hope sell some of them. I very much want to thank our panel. Thank you, Glenn, Adam, Joyce, Doug. It was an excellent discussion and a lot of excellent questions. Thank you all for coming.